The other one who have class will be able to look at the video again online. We'll put the video so everyone can look at it after the lecture. So good evening, everyone, those online and those who are in the room tonight. We're very glad to welcome virtually Professor Antoine Picon to our School of Public Architecture. We've been trying to invite Professor Picon for several years now, as his work has been very influential in the development of our school, research agenda, and pedagogical projects, particularly through his transdisciplinary research between architecture, engineering, science studies, and technological history. Antoine Picon is an engineer. He has been trained as an engineer first in a very famous school in France called Polytechnique de Paris. Then he specialized in civil engineering with a degree from École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées, which means roads and bridges, in 1981. He then graduated as an architect from the École d'Architecture de Paris-Villemain, so with a French degree, terminal degree in architecture. And then he furthered his studies in history with a PhD from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, which is a social science school in Paris, with the highest honor, 1991. Antoine Picon served as a general engineer of road and bridges for many years, before becoming a professor and research director at École Nationale des Ponts et Chaussées in Paris, so an engineer school, very famous civil engineering school, very historical school in Paris. And then in 2002, he became the G.Ware Travelstead Professor of History of Architecture and Technology at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Professor Picon published extensively for the last 40 years, from one of his famous first book called French Architect and Engineer in the Age of Enlightenment in 1988, and his History of Modern Engineer in 1992, to his work on the impact of information technology on the territory, with his essay called The Situ Territory of Cyborgs in 1998, that we wish to see translated in English to share with our students. His research of the last 20 years have focused on the impact of digital mediums in architecture in the city, with essays such as Digital Architecture, Digital Culture in Architecture, An Introduction for the Design Profession in 2010, or the seminal Smart Cities, Spatialized Intelligence, 2015. His recent publications include Ornament, The Politics of Architecture and Subjectivity, and one of his most recent book called The Materiality of Architecture, that he will talk about today. Professor Picon research has received many awards, including a medal from the City Paris of City for his publication, twice, and the prize of the Book of Architecture from the City of Brieux, as well as George Safo Medal of the University of Gand in Belgium. In 2010, he was elected as a member of the French Academy of Technologies. He's also knighted in France, Knight of Arts and Humanities since 2015, and he's the chairman of the Foundation Le Corbusier in Paris. We're very pleased that he found some time tonight to talk to our students, even though we would have even preferred if he would have come to talk face to face. So we're very happy to have here, and please welcome, help me to join me to welcome, sorry, Professor Antoine Picon tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? That's fine?
Yes.
Okay. All good. Thanks.
So thank you for this very generous introduction, and thank you, of course, Professor Duvallon, for your invitation. So let me now share my screen and hopefully begin this lecture. So my lecture will revolve around what is the true nature of the impact of the digital in architecture. So let me begin by a somewhat provocative question, which is something truly new with the digital? So of course, 25 years ago, architecture was still produced mostly by hand. And since that time, we've seen the irresistible development of computers, all kinds of software, 3D printers, etc. What has been their impact on architecture? On the one hand, we've seen all kinds of new geometries made possible by the computer. But on the other hand, most projects designed with computers still look relatively traditional. This one, for example, 10 years ago, won a prize for computer rendering. So this could be also dubbed as digital architecture. Similarly, we talk a lot about digital fabrication, and we may perhaps enter a world in which robots will play a major role in the construction industry. But at the same time, traditional industrialized techniques remain dominant in a lot of countries, beginning with China. So one may wonder there again, to what extent are the changes brought by the digital so important beyond the rhetoric of innovation? One could even question more radically the notion of a digital revolution in architecture by noting that the digital turning point itself is not something completely radical without precedent. It is actually the last stage in a more than a century evolution. We tend to believe that everything is new around us, big data, Amazon, etc. Actually, what we're experiencing today is the result of a series of change, at least a three-tiered evolution. So at the end of the 19th century, the first moment is when actually data becomes information, in other words, becomes a major dimension of social life. It enables, giant companies like here, the Prudential Insurance Company at the turn of the 20th century to function. It enables also companies to sell articles using the mail. It enables states to manage their citizens, etc. So first moment, which is actually the invention of an information-based society. Second moment, something like half a century later, around the 1940s, the beginning of the invention of new machine that will be soon called the computer. And the 1950s, 1960s, computer developed. This is actually the first machine, the UNIVAC, to be commercialized in the United States. And these periods ends with the early development of what will become the internet. And then the third moment, the one we're living through, is actually when computing becomes pervasive. You can find chips in your phones, of course, but you can find them in your washing machine, in your cars, pretty much everywhere. And it becomes also individual. And the rise of the smartphone is very typical of that. So we believe that everything around us is new, but actually this is rooted in a more than century-long evolution. And ideas such as MOOCs, such as Zoom teaching, are actually rooted in a long prehistory of these notions. For example, this is the dream of a Zoom class, but this dates from the 1900s. So what is new? We may believe that, is it an evolution or is it a revolution? I will argue that actually this is a revolution, but this is all the more a revolution that it's the crowning moment of a more than a century-long evolution. To be truly revolutionary, changes must be rooted in long-term evolution. But to understand the true nature of what we're facing today, we may have to go beyond technology, because the digital age is as much about social change than technological change. Think of social networks. They are clearly something that goes far beyond the technology. It changes, it changes the way we relate one to another. Think of WeChat and other applications like that. it's above all a cultural change. Technology has changed for sure, but society and we ourselves have changed. In some ways, to understand what's taking place today, we have to understand who we are. And in the digital age, we have become different individuals than who we used to be before. So this is where architecture plays a crucial role. Architecture, I will argue in this lecture, is not only about making buildings, about the technicality of space making and construction. It is about the relation we have with the material world. And I will argue that actually it's this relation which is changing. It is a relation that defines partially who we are. Another way to understand that would be actually to refer oneself to the notion of inhabiting. What does it mean to inhabit? In some ways, to inhabit, this is a modernist house in Hawaii, is actually to define partly who you are. To live in a house is actually to experience day after day its walls, its ceilings, the wood, the stone, the concrete, but it's something that partially defines who we are. So to summarize very quickly, what I intend to show you is that actually the digital, it's actually a change in the way we experience the world. It's the material world. It's a change in the way we experience who we are. And this is why it has a deep relation with architecture. So that, and in order to argue that, I will refer at a certain moment to the notion of materiality that I will try to precise. So this is the overall arc of this lecture. So now I'd like to begin actually by what is actually challenged today with the rise of the digital. Because actually one of the things that is taking place is a kind of challenge of some fundamental notion of architecture that used to be defining the very essence of what was architecture. And the two notions I'd like to refer to now that are challenged are scale and tectonics. So let me begin by scale. One of the things that has defined architecture pretty much everywhere on the planet since its dawn was the idea that, and it goes with the idea of inhabiting, that actually architecture has to do with scale. It has to do with the relation between the human body and the spaces it designs to inhabit. So one thing is sure is that the digital has actually jeopardized our traditional notion of scale. On computer screen, form very often seem to float without a definite scale. I remember this is from one of the young Turks of French digital architecture a few years ago, François Roche. I remember seeing this picture and asking the architect, François Roche, what is it? Is it a microscopic view? And François answered, no, this is actually a project for an urban megastructure. So one thing is sure, you're never, scale has become uncertain. So scale has become uncertain in a context in which you never know if something is very large or very small. Hence, by the way, the doubt we have with all these digital models, for example, is this really on the screen as large as what it suggests, or are we looking at just a model? So scale is no longer a sure thing, which is related to another fundamental feature, which is that, we live the global world. The world of globalization is a world in which scales seem to be completely perturbated and different from what we used to believe. For example, buildings used to be smaller than cities. Today, with giant airports and so many other things like that, we see buildings that are as large, sometimes larger than cities. Behind that, there is a very fundamental phenomenon, which is that information itself is something that has no definite scale. Hence, by the way, the fascination exerted at the beginning of the digital age by geometries such as the fractals, which are complex at every level. So I would argue that we are living in a world in which traditional scales are no longer that evident, as if we were living in the middle of a kind of gigantic crisis of scale. Now, another consequence of that is a crisis of tectonics, that is, structure understood as a guideline for design. You know, at the beginning of the digital, there was the belief that thanks to digital tool, one could develop harmoniously structural scheme so that they would become, you know, so that the project would seamlessly develop from them. But actually what we see more and more is actually, despite digital tools, a kind of, or perhaps because of them, a discrepancy between the initial intuition and the way things are built. Take, for example, the Sendai Mediatek by Toyo Ito, the celebrated building. The building was supposed to be all about a kind of liquid ambience, you know, as if one was looking at weeds in an aquarium. The way it's built is actually massive, sturdy. It has nothing to do with the initial intuition, as if structure, or if you like, tectonics, was no longer a sure guidelines to understand how design are actually built. The same is true of another emblematic project of the beginning of the digital age, the Yokohama terminal, which was supposed to be all about softness and undulation, and ended up being this very massive project. So behind that, going even further, there is a kind of crisis of traditional structural evidence. Take the Beijing Nest. You know, Herzog and de Meuron were very proud. It was actually a picture taken for their, you know, annual greeting cards. But these would have horrified architects of earlier generation because of its lack of traditional structural intelligibility. As if there again, tectonics had to be profoundly redefined in order to enable to convey what contemporary projects are about. So something deep is going on, something that has to do with a kind of quest for blurring of the distinction between the structural and the non-structural. This is another example of a facade in Paris, a new facade on a traditional building that has no clear structural meaning. So behind that, it may have to do with the fact that the digital has very often had to do with inflecting surfaces rather than really assembling parts. An architect, a British architect, Georges Legendre, wrote once that actually parametric conception reinforces that, because actually one actually manages more and more relationships between logic relationships between parts rather than traditional assemblage. This might have to do with a more general technological evolution, namely the fact that concrete technology is no longer, so it would be, before I move to concrete technology, so in a way, it's as if we were seeing the end of the Parthenon as a kind of model of intelligibility of architecture, as if architecture was no longer about assembling with a clarity of discourse parts of a building, but rather creating more complex effects, sometimes more linked to surface than to traditional tectonic evidence. It may have to do with a more profound evolution of technology, namely the fact that technology itself no longer function in clear structural way. Take a computer is actually not a traditional structure. It is actually a series of layers which are interfaced, as if writing code at interfaces between various technological layers was becoming more important than organizing structurally in a traditional way technological systems. This shift has also to do with the revolution in materials we've known. Take car bumpers. Until the 1960s, a car bumper was basically a structure. So it was something, a protection for the car that was basically organized like a kind of fortification. Today, a bumper is actually about designing a material, usually a composite material, that can actually manage shocks by deformation. So as if one was moving from designing structure to designing materials. More generally, also think of the distinction between a traditional infrastructure and a platform. You know, a traditional infrastructure, there is a clear hardware level as opposed to the software, a kind of structural level. For example, an urban network of sewers or etc. It's first and foremost pipes. Today, what is Uber? In Uber, in some ways, the software has become more important than the hardware. In other words, in technology, what used to be considered as superstructure has become often more important than the infrastructure. The app is more important than the cars, and platforms are very typical of this shift. And architecture seems in some ways to echo this general feature of the technological world, with its accent put on surface, on ornament, rather than traditional tectonic effects. As if, you know, echoing what the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard had called the postmodern condition, you know, the country architecture was all about codes, communication, and affect, using surface as the most important medium. And this relates to another phenomenon I've studied in a previous book of mine, which is the rise of the ornamental, or rather the return of the ornamental dimension, a dimension that had been banned by the modernist architecture and urbanism, and which is very strongly back. But what is ornament today? How does it function? It may be actually very different from what was called traditional ornament. One thing is sure, however, it is something that there again challenges traditional cultural codes. So that by the end, when we look at, you know, the Beijing Olympic Stadium, to return to it, is it a structure in the traditional sense? Is it a giant ornament? Is it a hybrid of the two? So all that to say that we live in a world right now in which some of the traditional foundational notion of architecture are challenged, as if architecture was no longer completely sure of its founding principles, as if there was a kind of massive destabilization of the fundamentals of the discipline. So let me move to what is perhaps behind all that, which is a changing experience of the material world, made possible by the digital. So the first thing to understand is looking at the computer. If you look at what was the computer at the beginning, it was actually a machine to compute. This is an advertisement for actually, one of the first electronic computers in 1940s, 1950s America. As you can see, a computer is literally a machine to compute. Then relatively quickly, the computer became also something that would enable to emulate thinking. And it was the beginning of cybernetics, later to become artificial intelligence. But the most striking feature, starting in the 1990s, is perhaps the fact that the digital has actually reshaped our sensation. It has become actually something that goes with a kind of change experience of the material world. This is actually an early experimental device at MIT Media Lab to connect touch, modeling using the hand, and computer modeling. So the computer has actually reshaped our senses. We don't see in the same way. We don't hear in the same way. We live in a different world. This is not the first time, by the way, that technology has reshaped our sensation. Think of the car. The car actually has introduced us to the general reign of speed and above all acceleration. We belong to a society, a culture in which acceleration is something we can experience very easily, which was clearly not the case before. So it has also introduced us to a new way to perceive object and landscape. So I won't enter into all the detail, but the computer has changed in some ways our relation with the physical world. So I would argue that this is pretty much the same with the computer. We don't see in the same way. We're, for example, completely used to zooming and dezooming. And at both ends, things look strangely alike. You know, a city seen from satellite, and on the right, the crystallization of concrete seem to have strange similarities because they are both pixelated. For the generation, you know, I'm talking to the students now, for your generation, you know, every image can be zoomed in and out, which introduces different codes of vision. Digital photographs are pretty much clear at every level. They're focused, they're multi-focused. So codes of vision have changed. You don't hear music in the same way. You don't touch in the same way. So in some ways, the entire sensory experience has been modified. So part of that is, of course, also the fact that we live in an augmented reality in which bits and atoms have become very often hard to separate. So this is part of this evolution, as if in some ways our experience of what's out there, what I call the physical world, was profoundly altered by all the digital tools that we use to relate to this world. So this is, of course, related to even broader changes. We don't understand nature in the same way. We, for example, talk more and more of material computation as if the material and the computed were the same thing, as if there was no longer a clear distinction between the abstract computation and the very concrete matter. So in this world, there are strange new properties that we pay attention to, such as emergence, that is to say, how order may stem from what apparently seems like chaos. It's a natural world in which we use new tools to fabricate, like robots, which will eventually enable us to overcome old distinctions, such as the distinction between prototyping and theories. And this is very much what the theme of the non-standard has been about. So where do I want to go through all that? To once again, the fact that the digital is a much more profound revolution than just computers entering our world. It's about actually our very perception of the world being completely changed, and even our understanding of nature. And now, in my next moment, what I like to argue is that actually this has profound consequences, or rather is inseparable from the way we understand ourselves. So, and this leads, of course, to this broad question. There is a lot of publication, etc., on the human versus the post-human, etc. Who are we as humans or post-humans? But it may be the same in the digital age. So to make myself understood, let's go back to the car. You know, I said the car has changed the relation to what surrounds us, to landscape, to speed, to acceleration, etc. But it has also changed our relation to our body. You know, in a car, we very often, when we accelerate in a nice car, we find ourselves invincible, you know, as if we were the master of the world. And, you know, the car has empowered us, you know, as if our body was glorious because it was empowered by mechanization. But our body is also at the same time strangely vulnerable to new types of accident. Terrible things may happen at every moment because of car accident, etc. So the very status of our body has become different. The novelist James Ballard wrote a novel, Crash, about this strange thing. So all that to say that technology is not only about the way we relate to the physical world, it's about the way we understand our body. It's about the way we relate to ourselves. So the digital, and you all know that, is very much about the body and more about the body. Think of biometrics. Think of all the possibilities of augmentation of the bodies that are developing today. This is, for example, a scientist showing a kind of circuit in order to monitor internally organs. So then we reach the point to which, the question, are we becoming cyborg-like, augmented creatures that have, in which flesh and technology are intimately associated? So this is among the questions we have today. Another question is whether we are still living only inside our body, whether our existence is still bounded by the limit of our flesh. We tend to inhabit more and more fully a series of spheres that extend far beyond our skin. We tend to be in networks, in browsing, in, very far away, at least it seems to us, the limits of our body. This is a theme, by the way, that contemporary art has explored again and again for the past 20 years. This is the Australian artist Delarc, exploring these kind of remote living possibilities. So we've become complicated people. On the one hand, we live outside ourselves partially. This is actually on the left, the network of an African teenager, as if we're network-like. On the other hand, sometimes we want to regroup. We want to inhabit again more fully our body. And this is what the contemporary fashion of tattoo was about still a few years ago. So what if we ourselves were actually network-like? As you may know, the contemporary model of the brain is no longer, a kind of integrated computer-like machine. It's actually a network, more internet-like than traditional computer chip-like. So what if actually what we believe is our inside is actually a giant network, a little bit like what lies outside us? And finally, what will be the new boundary between us and all these non-human forms of intelligence that are developing and on which China is, of course, leading? So these are not completely recent questions. Once again, we're facing something that is both an evolution and a revolution at the turn of the 19th and 20th century through films like Metropolis, novels, etc. Robots were already haunting the human imaginary. But who are we? Maybe the question. So again, there is a very strong link between the way we experience the world and the way we understand ourselves. Philosophers like Descartes and Locke, Condillac, and many others have insisted about that. The way I understand what is out there tells me something fundamental about who I am. So one of perhaps the best way to understand that is actually a philosophical story, a philosophical tale used by an 18th century philosophers to make us understand all that we owe to the exterior world. So this philosopher is a French guy called Condillac, and Condillac imagines a statue that has a brain and that has an intelligence, but which is completely uncultivated. And it has no senses. And then Condillac gives successively, enables the statue to hear, to touch, to see things, etc. And he imagines what are the discoveries of the statue. So which is the most important moment? You might believe it's vision, but actually it's not. For Condillac, it's touch, because the statue begins to move, realizes that there are objects out there that resist her. And because of this resistance, she realizes that she's someone in the world. So I would argue that the fundamental things that architecture does, so let's go back beyond tectonic scale, etc. There is something much more fundamental in architecture, which is that architecture disposes, orders matters so that it creates an experience of the world. And this is an experience that tells us something about who we are. And this is, to go back to what I said at the beginning, the deeper meaning of inhabiting. It is a physical experience that tells us something about ourselves. When Wenzhou-Kean famously said a library is fundamentally a human taking a book and moving towards the light, it means that actually what architecture does is to organize, the experience of things as basic as light, but it may be also the contact with wood, with brick, with light and shadow, and thus enabling human culture to emerge. So my argument is that actually architecture is about, and this is what I call inhabiting, machine occupy space, humans inhabit. And for me, the deeper meaning of digital architecture may be actually an inquiry about what it means to inhabit the strange new world that we're discovering day after day, thanks to our digital tools, but also our country science and technology. What it means to inhabit this world, but also by the same token, who are we inhabiting this world? And in my book on ornament, I argued that actually even movements like the digital grotesque of some years ago were about, who are we? Actually, the real question is, for example, who is this girl contemplating these ornaments with a certain pleasure? Who are we in contact with this architecture? So more generally, the role of ornament was always to organize a world that can be inhabited by humans. Another way to say that would be to say that architecture stages. Architecture is like a stage. You may have recognized, this is a famous Renaissance theater stage in Italy, but architecture is always a little bit like a theater stage. It suggests not only that humans have a place, but what they do matter. And this is making a place in which human action are meaningful, whatever they are. Architecture don't tell you what to do, but it tells you that what you do has a relevance. So this is the theme I've explored in my latest book about materiality. What I call materiality is actually not a completely objective quality. To call something, to consider that something is imbued with materiality means that it has a certain type of relation to us. We can touch it, we can feel it, we can see it. So, and this relation is something that is also inseparable of who we are. So country ornament for me is linked to this question, to, for example, who are we that can blur the sense of touch and the sense of vision? So, and for me, materiality is ultimately about what does it mean to inhabit the world through architecture, and what does it tell us about who we are? I'm reaching the last section of this lecture, and I'd like now to envisage first a certain number of shortcomings of the digital in architecture, and then move to what I'm calling the rebuilding the discipline. So shortcomings first. The first thing one may say is the digital so far, at least in Western countries, has been mostly mobilized for high-end program like fancy restaurant, Prada shop, that kind of thing. Very seldom for the greater number of people. There is a kind of political and social unconsciousness in digital architecture that is highly problematic. What does it, it's all the more problematic that the digital condition concerns every one of us. So why is digital architecture mostly an elitist production? How can it contribute to more politically and socially urgent tasks? That's for me a fundamental question. Another fundamental question is the kind of gap between the discourse and practices and experiments of digital avant-gardes and the question linked to the environmental challenge. As if, you know, in one corner of the room, you had actually people, you know, tampering with algorithm. In another corner of the room, people trying to address climate change, dealing with biosource material, gray energy, carbon zero question, etc. Actually, those two groups should merge. Digital architecture should be primarily today about the environment, etc., which is something that was true at the beginning. You know, some forerunners of our digital condition, like Buckminster Fuller, here it's the St. Louis Climatron, inspired by Fuller's design. So some of these early prophets of the digital were deeply convinced that computers had to go with managing the planet. So this is a very fundamental dimension that we need probably to rediscover. Another question is a kind of incertitude regarding time, history, and memory, as if digital architecture was most of the time oblivious of also symbolic question. I think, by the way, that one of the few brilliant projects by Peter Eisenman that addresses actually this issue of time, memory, and symbolism is actually the Berlin Memorial, which is why it makes it one of his best projects. As if, you know, very often digital architecture doesn't care about its place in history, about its relation to the symbolic, but architecture is actually always something that has to address the questions such as the symbolic, because architecture stays in time. Architecture is something that will stay at least until tomorrow. So it has to tell us about yesterday and not only about today. Architecture is about how do we move from past to present and from present to future. This is, by the way, one big question of the digital. Interestingly, among the first metaphor of what was to become the online world, you found in cyberpunk literature, like Gibson, for example, novels, etc., the comparison with the Las Vegas Strip. In Las Vegas, as we all know, something always happened, but by the end, it's as if nothing ever happened, as if history had become something irrelevant, as if time no longer truly mattered, just the instant, the present, the moment we live. Architecture cannot be limited to that. It has actually to reconnect with a deeper history, which is why, by the way, the question of tectonics and the crisis of tectonics is a problem, because the ruin or the possibility of ruination was something that connected past, present, and future, was something that inscribed architecture within the temporal condition, within the historical time. So what can be, shouldn't we reinvent a tectonic for today? Perhaps, you know, the fascination with Voronoi distribution may have to do with this ambition to reinvent something like a new tectonic. So to conclude this lecture, I think what the digital confronts us to is actually a series of crisis of traditional notion, or the way we understood traditional notion, the way we understood scale. Scale is no longer only synonymous of the human scale. Scale is a much more diffracted and complex question. The way we understood structure and tectonics, it's no longer something to be thought by analogy with a skeleton. Perhaps we should think of a tectonic of the skin. But anyway, we have to rethink this notion. We have at the same time exhilarating, fascinating new perspective, this new material world that is out there. Of course, you know, it's not that The world has changed, but we see it differently. And we see it differently because we are different and because inhabiting needs to be redefined. So my conclusion would be that in some ways the digital, but not only the digital, the climate change leads us to a very similar question, which is actually how to redefine the fundamentals of architecture. We believe that architecture is a stable discipline. Architecture has been always something that moves, that changes, that varies. You know, traditional Chinese architecture was different from the Vitruvian tradition that prevailed in Europe. So architecture is a moving thing. Architecture is constantly in evolution. So evolution and revolution, these are also characteristics of architecture. So in other words, as a kind of final provocation, what could be the primitive art of the digital age? What kind of founding metaphor or story should we invent to make sense of what it means today to inhabit what is, again, the primitive art of the digital age? And on that, I'll end this lecture. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Antoine, for this very dense lecture. I will let either the participant online or our students here to ask a couple of questions. Anyone? I'm going to check the chat. Anyone in the room? I have a mic here.
I know it's a lot to digest, but don't be afraid to ask questions.
You have a question?
And you can use the chat, yes.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your speech. And I'm a sophomore, and now we started to use digital method to express our design, such as Rhino, AutoCAD, and so on. However, the renderings we made were maybe a little bit fake, not like the real, and maybe abstract architecture diagram is also a good way to express our idea, and how to strike a balance between these two.
Well, there is no, can you hear me or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is no universal recipe. But once again, I think the true challenge is to understand that today, you know, architecture is not an abstract thing. Architecture is about the experience of the material world. So you have, and actually, I think part of the challenge with digital tools is to recreate the intuition of the material world that you had with traditional tools. To give you an example, you know, when you drew by hand, scale was something much more evident to understand than when you drew with a computer. Because when you drew by hand, the very gesture you made were commensurate with what you design. So I think when you use actually all the software, there is a link that has been broken and that you need to recreate. So I think the real question for you is that in some ways you have to forge a new intuition of the world that surrounds you and to connect it to the way you use digital tools. This is what I call in some ways, you know, rethinking the fundamentals of architecture in order to understand how we inhabit. Does it make sense? Who asked the question already?
Yes, she agrees.
Okay.
Yeah, she understands.
Good.
Matthew?
Hi, Professor. Thanks for sharing this lecture. I have a question about like how digital tool and this tradition architectural thinking. So do you think during this kind of digital and traditional architecture progress, do you think the traditional thinking or the traditional architectural thinking will be finally replaced or take place by digital model or digital thinking way in architecture?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. It's more complex than that. I would say, you know, the present doesn't erase the past. It adds to it. So we have to consider that architecture, when I say you have to recreate or reground architecture, it doesn't mean you have to forget. Architecture is two things. It's a discipline with rules that change from one period to another, but it's also a tradition. You know, when you visit in China, a beautiful ancient temple, you're very probably not going to build a replica of an ancient temple. It may happen, but usually it's not what is asked to young architects. But this ancient temple is going to feed your reflection on the relation between materials and humans, between space and humans. So in other words, what once defined architecture, even if it's less relevant to produce concrete architecture, still is part of architecture. You know, just like, you know, the identity of a country is no longer what it may have been 300 years ago. You know, 300 years ago, France was a monarchy. It's a republic. But, you know, France is still partly defined by the fact that it was a monarchy 300 years ago, and we have a legacy of palaces, etc. Just like China has a complex and very long history. So we have to understand that architecture is both something that is looking toward cutting edge principles, etc., but always at the same time a tradition that critically re-examines and feeds from example from the past. Which is why actually you still have classes in history of architecture, is because you need to be able to meditate on precedents. You know, of a great architectural thinker of the Italian Renaissance once wrote that architecture is based on the reasoned meditation of past examples. So again, doesn't mean you're going to imitate them, but you're going to feed from them.
Hi, Professor. I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you. I and my classmates did a research about cyberspace. And
I didn't get it. Can you repeat louder, please?
I and my classmates did a research about cyberspace.
Yes.
And one of the main character of cyberspace is high tech and low life. I think in the future, people will spend more time online. For example, now more people work at home. For example, they use Zoom to work and have meetings. And maybe in the future, we will have a VR room in our house. So,
yes.
Yeah, and as for your lecture, we are talking about digital architecture. So how do you think digital architecture can transform people to a new lifestyle?
Very good question again. A couple of things. The first is, of course, we're spending more time online, but we still have bodies. And, online life has revealed to us how noise can be a terrible thing. How, for example, if you're a couple and you're both Zooming in the same room, it's sometimes unbearable. It has revealed us, in some ways. So to make a long story short, we're never going to inhabit only the virtual world. In Hollywood movies, perhaps, but in reality, we're going actually constantly to move at the interface of the two worlds. This is what I've called augmented reality. We're going to move in traditional space, but also in cyberspace. Very often, when you walk with your, looking at your smartphone in the street, you're moving in both spaces at the same time. You're moving in real time, in real space and online space.
Yes.
One of the tasks of architecture for me is to today, this is what I call inhabiting, by the way. Inhabiting today means that we no longer inhabit only the physical space. We inhabit a blend of physical and online. And the task of architecture is actually to make that livable. So far, it's not always very livable. And, so how do we fully inhabit in a pleasant way these more complex physical plus cyberspace? Also, sometimes, how are we able to disconnect? You may have experienced sometimes, that life may be better sometimes when you don't look at your smartphone and your email and text message for a couple of hours. And the task of architecture may be also sometimes to suggest that it's time to disconnect, to just enjoy the view from your window or etc. So this is what I called it rethinking inhabiting. How do we, in some ways, inhabit this new world, which is very different. I completely agree with you. We may have virtual rooms, but the food we ingest is still very physical food. We may have etc. But sometimes our eyes are tired, or there is too much light, or we need, take sound. One thing that is evident with Zoom is that sound in an apartment, and when your partner is very loud on Zoom and yourself are trying to concentrate, it's a problem. So you realize that actually the physical and how we organize it, and what do we see, what don't we see, can we hear, etc. Those are very urgent questions. In some ways, the more we live online, the more actually also we have to live in the physical space.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other students here? Oh, sorry. In the back.
Hi, Professor. It's still me. Thanks for your answer about the relationship between traditional architecture and digital architecture. I think your answer is really wide and make me think a lot. So, in my experience, I feel like somehow there's two sides of, I think, very digital and traditional architecture. So now the tools we study are kind of mostly used this kind of digital tool to design the architecture. But we still get a lot of information, such as history and theory about this kind of traditional architecture. And in my kind of perspective, that architecture is something that carried about memories and events happened in the space. But so in this stage, somehow we stay in this digital stage, but we still look at back about the history and tradition. And but in somehow like people are still exploring different kinds of digital way to like generate the architecture shape, which is kind of totally new and not have a very strong connection between the what we have kind of learned about the traditional architecture. So do you think how do you think as a student or learner of architecture, how we balance this kind of digital and the traditional in this architectural learning?
I think, first of all, I truly understood what I had learned in architecture a couple of years after finishing my architecture studies. So you're not going to be able to connect all the dots because it's just too much to take. And when I say architecture is a meditation, it means that it takes time to understand things. So I think right now, you may have the impression things are disconnected between, cutting edge digital tools and classes in history. You don't see the relation, etc. Actually, little by little, you're going to see dots aligning themselves, etc. So I'm going to answer the question on the chat after. But so I think, first of all, is to be aware that you yourself need time for that. I think more generally, architecture has known in the past 20 years a series of innovation which were dramatic. So I think for the past 20 years, it has mostly been about, exploring these new things. Let these be the digital, but, take also the consequence of the environmental revolution, etc. So now, perhaps the time is coming to reconnect, to actually reconnect past and present, etc. Because this is a key. If you think again, what is a monument? Etymologically, at least in the West, a monument is something that makes you think about something that is no longer there. This is, by the way, what a grave is. Adolf Loos famously said that, architecture is always in a way or another connected to this idea of the grave, but it means basically that architecture celebrates both, that it's here and there in the present, but also that there is something that belongs to the past that is made present through architecture. This is what a monument is about. It celebrates things which are, not necessarily there, etc. So I think the time now has come to reconnect, the new with the, the enduring tradition of architecture. So I think the new gradually is becoming less new, though I'll come back in a moment to artificial intelligence. There's still a lot of exciting new things, but I think that the time has come to reconnect. A little bit like during the Industrial Revolution, when iron emerged, it was all about new forms, etc. But past a certain moment, the question becomes, how do we reconnect? So let me try to address the question in the chat, which says you mentioned the advent of thinking machines. I actually believe that creativity is going to evolve. Actually, I completely agree. In my class, I give a lecture on artificial intelligence in which precisely argue that we will have to collaborate with a machine. What the machine cannot do for us, so far at least, is to tell us how we inhabit. Again, a machine can occupy a space. It does not so far inhabit it. So this may be perhaps the task of the humans to, in collaboration to the machine, but still to be responsible for by the end, advancing the cause of what matters to humans. But I completely agree. I think artificial intelligence, if it because we're still far from the general intelligence. But if we get there, it's going to be a very profound revolution, which is, by the way, something interestingly, people like Negroponte in the 1990s, the computer emerged in the 1960s, sorry, in architecture. The first experiments on computers were centered on this idea of a collaboration, whereas we've reduced so far the computer to a drawing machine. So I think having, collaborating with artificial intelligence, even if it's not general, it can still be specialized, but change the way we design. So I do believe, yes, this is probably the next front with climate change. But I still think that after 20 years of newness, time has come to reconnect with theory and history, not to become, not to over-historicize everything, but at least to reconnect what we're doing today with, things we used to do yesterday.
Thank you. Rose?
Hi,
Go ahead.
Professor. I have a question. I heard you mentioned the experience from the material world, the physical world, and also we have the experience in the digital world. I wonder if it's possible for us to create the kind of architecture can avoid us from replacing from the digital method, digital techniques, because in material world we need human need, physical needs like eating or cleaning like that. But if we really need these needs, the machine will replace this too. So I wonder if there's a way for us to create architecture methods can prevent this kind of replacement.
I'm not sure I've understood your question. Vincent, can you help me on that? Or can you just, I'm not sure I understood completely what was your question. Sorry about that.
I think the question from Rose was, is as the machine are replacing humans in a lot of tasks, is architecture a form of resistance to this?
I think architecture, so sorry to complicate things, but after all, architecture is a complicated business. I think the task of architecture is actually both. On the one hand, architecture, if you take the relation of architecture to technology, on the one hand, the task of architecture is to make technology more, more easy to mobilize, etc., to open the building to technology. But in the other hand, the task of architecture is also partially to suggest modes of resistance to technology. Take the digital world, again, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because we communicate more easily, we can use WeChat, we don't need to send, to pile up, traditional physical cards anymore, etc. Communication is easier, etc. But we can get trapped in it. We can become prisoner of our technology. So I think one of the tasks of architecture is both to make the use of technology easier. For example, electricity has, one of the tasks of late 19th century architect was how to make electricity something that could enter the home, but also how to make space something that is not only submitted to technology. So I think you've always to think both in terms of facilitating, but also resisting. And this is where actually architecture is a complex practice. So what's your, I have a question on this chat. What is your suggestion on building structured class for architecture students in today's digital world? I would say perhaps one thing that is evident starts from materials, because I think materials, there has been this silent revolution of materials, which is profoundly one of the most profound revolution. So I think you still need, as an architect, to understand how very physical forces exert themselves. What is a bending moment? What is compression as opposed to traction? You know, these very elementary things to understand what is a vault. So whether you like it or not, you need that, because the digital is not going to tell you, you know, on screen, if you don't have an intuition of how a vault behaves, the screen is not going to tell it to you. So you still need to have that. You need probably today more things about materials, because the field of materials has demultiplied. And you need above all to know how you reconnect digital tools and material intuition. You know, this is, by the way, also a question for engineers. Engineers used to use massively structural intuition. Today they have computing tools, but they need to know how to articulate their intuition and the digital tools. So I think that's probably the crucial questions.
One of the students, CJ, I think is asking something
About virus?
about Facebook and Meta University, I think. I haven't.
Well, on the virus, you know what? We're back to something we used to know, that, you know, we had forgotten for almost a century that viruses were a powerful and very disturbing things. In the 19th century, for example, the cholera plagued regularly European cities. And the first time the cholera went in Paris, it killed something like 20,000 people. 20,000 people at the time was roughly 1 person out of 30 in Paris in the 1830s. So just try to imagine 1 people out of 30 dead. And then you realize that actually in the 19th century, and cholera pretty much returned every 15 to 20 years in Europe in the 19th century. So then you realize that actually we may be back to normal, whether we like it or not. And by the way, what I found interesting with a virus is that the most efficient way to fight it, it's not using cyber tools. It's about, you know, physical distance and mask. So if you want to see a demonstration that physical space still matters, think of the virus. You know, it tells us that, you know, it's not with an app on your iPhone or whatever that you're going to solve, to limit the epidemics. It's by physical distance and masking, which are very material artifacts. So that would be my first thing. Second thing, Facebook, I haven't followed so far closely the Meta University of Facebook. Let's say that I have an immense, though I have a Facebook page, like pretty much everyone, because it enables me, among other things, to be connected to my former students. I'm very reluctant to let Facebook tell me what the future of knowledge is about. When I look at the number of fake news that Facebook has encouraged, I'm not very confident that this is the best media to talk about our universe. Okay, I get it better. So I think, so, you know, this is there again, not a recent question. In the 1990s, someone called Bill Mitchell was at the time the head of the Media Lab, was writing that one of the tasks of the architect in the future would be not only to organize the physical space, but to contribute to the organization of the online world. And actually, you know, there are a number of companies, Google, etc., they employ a lot of designers and architects. So there is a role of architects. I still think that what is irreplaceable with architecture is that it's not only a kind of mental construction or etc. It's something that resists. It's something that has a strong physical component. So yes, it will change the architect because it has begun. You know, how do we design for people who have constantly smartphones in their pockets? How we design, etc. This is a question for today. How, you know, this, for me, by the way, the most crucial question these days is not what can we do online, but what should we still do in the physical space? For example, you know, you took university at first. For me, the central question for the future of teaching is not what can we do on Zoom, because we know we can do a lot of things on Zoom. But the real question is what should we do still in the physical world? For example, you take this lecture, you know, it's true that it can be like I am right now, thousands of kilometers away from you, and I can give a lecture, but what could I do if I was there with you in the same room? That would be different. And that's the real question for the future. And that's an architectural question. You know, the question is not what can we do with digital tools? The question is what should we continue to do in the physical space when our bodies are close one to another?
Thank you. I think I have a last question online from someone who sent it to me. You show a picture of Fuller's dome, and then you mention the fact that the pioneer of computation in architecture thought about computation as a way to design climates. And just before, our colleague Spencer mentioned the fact that the digital tool is not necessarily a drawing tool, but it's a thinking tool. I was wondering how intellectually you're bridging the climate crisis and the digital tools in architecture. Like, is it two separate topics, or there is a way to bridge things, particularly through the code, the AI-based design or anything?
AI may be one way, but I do think, I think bridging the gap between these two domains of research and experiment may be among the most urgent things to do. You know, you mentioned I wrote a book on smart cities. It is more and more evident that smart doesn't solve climate change, because there are very concrete problems like what do we do with the rise of the ocean? This is not something you can solve with digital tools. What do we do with massive rain? What do we do with etc.? So, but we have actually to find ways to use the digital in a productive way to solve environmental question, and conversely, you know, to have the environmental and the digital really be in dialogue. So artificial intelligence may be one thing. The other is the quality of the human experience, what I call materiality. And I think this is also a key element for me. That's to say, we have to, you know, I was asked once, well, what was my relation to phenomenology? I'm not a phenomenologist insofar that I believe that human experience change, but I think we have to restart from the human experience. We have to restart from that. And the human experience will be more and more that, you know, in the near future, we'll have digital tools, but we'll have also serious problem with heat, with cold, with etc. And how do we address these questions? You know, to be also very concrete, for example, one of the problems in the near future with extreme heat wave or digital, how are we going to adapt our digital tools so that they can stand them? So this is actually a challenge for the smart city. What happens to a smart city if the ocean rises and floods cables, etc., etc. So we realize that actually these things are deeply interconnected, and we've got actually to be very pragmatic and think in terms in relatively practical terms. This is not only a big conceptual question. It's actually a very down-to-earth material question.
Thank you so much. I think we're done with the question online and with the question face-to-face. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Students were very glad and engaged a lot, so I'm very happy. I think we can thank a lot very much Professor Picon for his lecture tonight.
Thank you all for having me. And and thank you, Graham, for these last remarks. Well, to be continued. Let's hope one of these days I can visit your university. And meanwhile, Vincent and the students and your colleagues, thank you all very much for attending this lecture.
Thank
It has
you.
been a
Thanks
true
a lot.
pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Bye.